Hi there, we're here today to talk about bluegill fishing. Bluegills in Iowa are a very common game fish species. They're found in almost all of our water bodies, whether it be the public lakes and ponds and reservoirs that we have, but they're even found in private farm ponds. Almost all Iowa farm ponds have been stocked with bluegill by private landowners, and those folks, they're also found in the Mississippi River and some of the backwaters. They don't like current, so that's why we typically find them in lakes and ponds. Bluegill fishing, the reason bluegill fishing is so popular in Iowa is they're one of the easiest fish to catch. It doesn't take a lot of equipment. It takes basic tackle. They're great for kids because they're easy to catch. You can find them near the shoreline. They're around structure. They're just a fun fish to catch. Another great thing about bluegill, they're very good to eat. They're one of our better tasting game fish species. And there's a pretty liberal limit where you can keep 25 bluegill here in Iowa. Now we're going to talk about some basic techniques and tackle used to catch more bluegills. One of the most important things to remember about bluegills is they have fairly small mouths. These are not big fish. A big bluegill might weigh 3/4 of a pound. An average one's only going to weigh 1/4 of a pound. And what I like to think about is the size of the end of my pinky is about the size of an average bluegill mouth. So the lures you're going to use are going to need to be as small or smaller than the end of your pinky. Let's take a look at some of the ones that I like to use to catch bluegills. They make a variety of different lures that are small in nature. These are some marabou and some rubber jigs that I have in my hand here. The important thing is these are quite small. This little black jig here is only 1/32 of an ounce. This one's approaching about 1/16 of an ounce, but you wouldn't want to go any heavier than that. Matter of fact, I've also had success using a 1/64 ounce lead head jig. And again, they make the marabou, they make rubber bodies, a variety of colors. Just about anything can work, but what I like to think about is the clearer the water, the darker the lure you want to use. So if you're fishing in really crystal clear water, I go for my browns and my blacks and my greens, light dark greens. But if you're fishing in fairly turbid water and you can't see down very far, then I might use a little bit brighter colored, like a yellow or a red. Another thing that people need to remember about these small bluegill mouths is hook size selection is really important. Let me grab a couple of hooks here for comparison purposes. I have two different hooks here in my hand. It might be a little bit difficult to see. This one here is a number 4 hook. It's about the size of the end of my pinky. It's really too big to catch bluegill. They're going to have difficulty fitting that in their mouths. So you want to go much smaller. This is a number 8 size hook, and I've even used as small as number 10 size hook. Much smaller than the end of my pinky, and will easily fit inside of an average bluegill's mouth. Of course, with a hook, you're going to have to add some bait to that. And let's talk a little bit about the bait selection. One of the mistakes I see people use is they use too big of a piece of night crawler. You really just need a piece of night crawler. So let me demonstrate that for a second here. Get down into my worm box here. Let's pull out a night crawler. Again, this full-size night crawler would be way too much for a bluegill. I mean, they might get into their mouths, but they're not going to get to the hook until they've got 3/4 of it down. So we just want to use a piece of night crawler. So what I like to do is just pinch off about 1 inch of night crawler, about that length. And then I'll take my small hook that I showed you earlier, take my small hook, and I'll just hook the worm one time through one of the ends so it'll hang naturally from the hook. And that will easily go inside of a bluegill's mouth. The other thing you can do to help kids catch more fish, obviously this live bait on a hook works well, but even if you're using a small jig and the bite's not very aggressive, I'll put a small piece of night crawler on my jig like so. Again, just hook it once. Or they also make a lot of these different prepared baits. And this one kind of looks like a little worm. Put it in my hand here so you can see it. Again, you can see how small that piece of prepared bait is. It's very small, and I'll put this hook it one time through my jig head so it hangs naturally. And this will help you catch more fish if the bite happens to be light, or if you're fishing with kids, because the fish will hold on to it a little bit longer because it has some flavor to it. Now let's talk a little bit about some tackle, rods and reels, and line selection, and also the size of bobber you're going to want to use. But one thing that's important to remember with bluegill fishing is it's very inexpensive equipment. You don't have to have the high fancy graphite rod. You can use the basic rod that you get when you were a kid. A lot of kids and boys and girls start off with this type of rod. I started with this type of rod and reel. It's just as effective at catching bluegills as the lighter stuff. Sometimes these come with a little bit too heavy a line. but they still, bluegills are easy to catch. They'll still bite with heavier line, but you might increase your catch if you go to lighter line. Because you're using very light lures, the bait will be presented better, it'll look nicer in the water, it'll be easier to catch fish with lighter line. So what I've gone to is a little bit more sophisticated piece of equipment. This is an open face fishing reel where you can see the line on the outside. This is 4-pound test line, very light, but it works well when you're using these small jigs that we're talking about. They're difficult to catch cast with the other type of rods, and they're a little bit easier to cast with these lighter rods. And then also, bluegills can be a lot more fun if you're using a very light rod. This rod happens to be an ultralight rod, and so even a small bluegill is going to put quite a bend in this rod. And even though this rod that we talked about earlier is fun, it doesn't quite have the fight isn't quite as difficult with this type of rod. But for kids, it's great because they're going to catch fish, they're going to be happy. One of the things that can be difficult under windy conditions in these small light lures is casting. These don't cast very well when it's windy. So a lot of times I'll add a bobber to help me get my lure where I want it to be. And it's really important if you're fishing with kids because it's difficult enough for an adult to cast one of these light jigs or lures. It's much more difficult for kids. It'll also help kids catch fish because they can see when the fish is biting. Let's talk a little bit about bobber selectivity. Grab some bobbers. That one's there. Here's some bobbers in my hand, and one of the things you'll notice right away is that these two bobbers, while similar, one is much larger. This bobber here is actually probably too big for bluegill fishing because it's so large that a bluegill is going to have difficulty pulling it underwater. They're going to figure out something's not right and they're going to spit the lure out. So I like to use as small a bobber as I can to keep my bait suspended off the bottom where I want it to be. Even this basic bobber here, this red and white one that's very common, it's about a quarter size in diameter. You don't want to be any bigger than that. That's going to be too big for a bluegill to pull under. So again, with light lures, we want to use small bobbers and light line, and it'll help you catch more fish. This is late May, even into early June. It's the time of year when bluegills spawn in Iowa. Water temperatures generally are in the upper 60s this time of year, and the great thing about bluegills is they're group spawners, or we call them colonial spawners. In other words, they kind of find an area near shore that has the right substrate, and they like firm bottom like sand or gravel, and they'll actually build their nest side by side. With the sunfish family, it's the male that builds the nest, and the females come in and lay their eggs and leave. So the males will stay on these nests for up to 2 to 3 weeks sometimes, and so there's a good time period where you can get out, find a lot of fish in a small location. We were working along the shoreline here, and we caught a couple of fish in just 2 casts, and I thought, well, I bet there's a bed there, and we're going to make a couple more casts to see if we can't pick up a fish. So let's give it a try. There's a nice male bluegill we caught off the spawning beds. The reason you can tell that this is a male bluegill is you look at the belly area here on the males, it's more orangish color. The females, it'll be more yellowish coloration. So when you start catching a couple of these males like this, you've probably found the spawning beds. And that's a great place to concentrate your efforts because, they're group spawners. There'll be a lot of fish in a small location. The great thing about bluegills is you can even catch them from shore just as easy as you can from a boat. They like to hang around the shoreline. You just got to kind of work along the shoreline and find the right spot. You're going to catch bluegills like this.